Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The 2024 summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation is taking place in Beijing with a theme to advance modernization and build a high-level China-Africa community with a shared future. While China and Africa are ready to raise their relationship to a new level, what to expect out of the summit meeting? What does a high-level community with a shared future mean to both sides? Join us for our discussion today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today is His Excellency Mr. Nabil Fahmy, former Foreign Minister of Egypt. Welcome to Dialogue, Mr. Fahmy.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation.
So this summit is taking place after 6 years from the last summit, and we know a lot has happened over the past years. You saw COVID, and of course there's rising tensions between China and the US, and conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza. So how important is this meeting now we are having after so many has happened or happening?
It's an extremely important meeting for several reasons. You touched on some of the parameters. Politically, in terms of international relations, the world is in a state of disorder where everything is changing at the same time or being challenged, including the respect for international law, with more and more inclination to use force as an expression of action rather than engagement. So that's the first thing. I think this is an opportunity for China and Africa, which is a continent of over 50 nations, to discuss how they see the future, what needs to be corrected, amended, added, changed, and so on, including, I would argue, the membership of the Security Council of the United Nations, which is completely unrepresentative of the world. Secondly, I would argue that given the economic weight that China has, given the resource weight and market weight that Africa has, and I would add to that its location, I think it's an important opportunity for both countries to factor in how to put together some significant projects, adding to what has already happened, frankly, with the Belt and Road Initiative, among others. But I'm sorry for the long answer, but let me also add a point here. There is a lot of common interest and common thinking between China and Africa. It's not identical because we have different priorities and different sizes, but there's a lot of common interest. And I think the success of the conference will be determined not by a material value for projects, although that's important, but it will be determined how we translate what both Africa and China have talked about: mutual interest, respect for each other, shared successes. The world cannot function in a polarized situation, and we need to work together.
Mm-hmm. We'll speak of the future, Mr. Fahmy. You know, the theme of this year's summit is, quote, joining hands to advance modernization and build a high-level China-Africa community with a shared future, you know, sort of, of the content you mentioned earlier. Okay, high-level community and also advanced modernization. What's your understanding of such a statement?
Again, it's a great point, and that's why I'm very enthusiastic about the conference. Well, greater African-Chinese engagement requires two things. Two important things. One is that we need to understand each other better. It's not simply about material cooperation, but I would argue people-to-people engagements are very important. I visit Beijing and Chinese capital cities frequently, and I can tell you I was very happy to see the number of African students in Chinese universities. But let me add to that. Besides the people-to-people engagements, I think it's very important to add to the major infrastructural projects that have happened and that have been extremely useful for everyone. I think it's important to add a component of transfer of technology more in terms of the new and coming technologies rather than in terms of only transactions about what was needed in the past. I really believe that science and technology will be the determining factor between those who are on the bandwagon to progress and those who feel that they are left behind.
Mm-hmm. Well, related to this point in the transfer of technology or export of technologies, Chinese Ministry of Commerce recently announced that the country will expand institutional opening up to Africa and also deepen cooperation in industrial and supply chains. Tell us your understanding of such policy change, opening up to African countries, and also this industrial and supply chains. What's behind that? What's that purpose?
Sure, I'll be very, very frank with you. I've been a follower of China for many, many years, although I'm not by any chance an expert. Decades ago, China was very reticent, cautious about engaging the world beyond a balance of strategic interests. In my visits to China over the last decade, which have been many times a year except for the COVID period, more and more I saw Chinese being very curious about details that foreigners bring with them. And also, I find Chinese much more confident in sharing their views with respect to how things can be done more. So there is an opening up between China and the developing world because of the shared concept of mutual respect, shared interest, win-win situations. But again, I want to move further beyond transactional operations, much more to strategic infrastructural relationships. Therefore, it's important to have direct contacts between our universities, direct contacts between our industries, debates about how to move forward, and from each of us to gain from the experiences of the other. Let me very quickly just mention a personal anecdote. I established a school for global affairs and public policy at the American University in Cairo after I left the Egyptian diplomatic service, but before I became foreign minister. And the first thing I did in the second term was take the students to China. And people at the university were wondering, you're an American university in Cairo, why are you choosing China? And I said, I'm choosing China because I want to learn. And the world is not only Egypt and the US, or Egypt and the West. And I want to learn more and more about opportunities and how best to handle them. And I used to invite 50 Chinese students every year to come and visit our university and to get acclimatized to Egypt, to Cairo, even though I knew that they would come to visit us at the American University, which teaches in English, but then go on to a year stay at Egyptian national universities, which taught in Arabic because they wanted to learn Arabic. And I was completely supportive of this. How do you deal with engaging others? The best way to deal with that is, on the one hand, understanding them, but on the other hand, theory and people-to-people engagements are not enough. They have to be coupled with concrete projects where people see the benefit of the relationship.
Well, you mentioned several points here, of course. On one hand, you talked about how to engage other parties, other countries. Let's say here in the West, you have the US. In the East, you have China. For African countries, after witnessing this rising tension between Beijing and Washington, do you think people in African countries feel this sense of pressure, or somehow they have to choose, or is this the right path to basically deal both sides and make the most out of it?
Well, yes and no. The answer to your question, in short, is the best way is to deal with a lot of different parties and manage the relationship to your benefit. And it's not saying we're going to counter China with the US or vice versa. a very amateurish, unsophisticated approach that is of the past. It is really, how do I gain the most from my relations with China and from my relations with the West? And what are the issues that I cannot address? And they're not, by the way, premeditated issues from the counterpart. There may be things that don't fit in our societies. Or if I look at, just for example, China is a very impressive economy by any standard. And when I visited China frequently, one of the things that always surprised me was how big everything was. Well, in some cases, big is useful. In other cases, if you apply it to small countries in Africa, you cannot function of the same size. So one has to learn from that advantage, but also understand the potential and what not to do in the process. I believe it is not a conflict of civilizations, but rather how we develop ourselves to deal with each other. It's not only about big powers. It's not only about Russia, US, and China. It's about the world. And China has taken a constructive, positive approach in its engagement with the developing world, including Africa. Mm-hmm. And that's a very good beginning, but let's deepen it and make it not only concrete and transactional, but also cultural and civilization.
Yes, speak of different civilization. Of course, China-Africa relationship. Traditionally, China has this 5-no approach to African countries. Basically, that is no interference in the development path of individual countries. For example, no imposition of China's will, and no attachment of political strings, and no seeking of selfish political gains, etc. So, can we say this is basically in common and also shared and respected by African countries, or practiced by African countries? This is something very important, shared by both sides, or common practice between China and African countries?
I agree with you, and that's why at the very beginning I mentioned the terms mutual respect, shared interest, win-win situations. That's something that's made the African response to China quite open, despite many, many warnings from the West, and many, many attempts, frankly, from the West to slow down opening up on China. But I would, again, like to argue we will try to make the most of what serves our interest and serves your interest. And I think that there's tremendous amount of room to cover that is mutually beneficial without getting into an engagement. I mean, and I'll be very candid with you. I'm not interested as an Egyptian to be in the middle of a Chinese-American battle.
No.
But I would not ask you, and I'm pretty sure that even though China is a global power, China is not interested in getting into all of the proliferation of problems in the Middle East politically. You may carry that responsibility a little bit as a permanent member of the Security Council, but I would not recommend that you get engaged in every fight in the Middle East, especially if they are domestic fights. And that's why the 5 no's that you mentioned are extremely important.
Yeah, respect and the mutual beneficial relationship, of course. You also mentioned about concrete, the importance of concrete projects, for example, for cooperation. As it reminds me of, years ago, the African continent is often regarded, or was regarded as a hopeless continent, as represented in the article in the Economist magazine. But now the narrative has shifted to, say, a promising continent, the rising continent here. And then one Africa scholar, Paul Frimpong, he said that progress that unlocked Africa's development can be traced back to China's flagship project, BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, which focuses on big ticket infrastructure projects, heavy investment from the Chinese side, together with African countries. So how do you see the role of BRI in, let's say, the development of African countries here?
Sure. I mean, look, the reality is a lot of Africa suffered in the beginning of the last century from decades of traditional European colonization. And essentially, during that period, the infrastructure in Africa became weaker and weaker, except where it related to areas where raw materials were taken out of Africa to Europe and to the industrialized world. So one of the first and common points of interest and needs in Africa was infrastructure. You can't develop a market if you can't produce a product and move it from one area to the other. You can't export, import, or anything without a road system. You can't have a real connectivity without a strong electrical grid. And I can go on and on with examples, but you understand what I mean. So the initial effort made by China made tremendous sense and was extremely useful for the majority of African countries because it dealt with the immediate concern where they had to, this was the threshold, the platform where all African countries had to build first. Now, the point and the reason why I mentioned technology is exactly because of what you mentioned in this question. I think Africa has developed significantly. We're not yet at the level of developed countries, easy competition with the stronger countries, but we have developed significantly. But to move to that next level of competition, the next level of best resources for our people, it will involve continuing upgrading of our infrastructure system, which the BRI project was a very important part of, but it will also involve raising the level of technology of our products. And that's really where I think China can play a very important role.
As we talked about earlier about this industrial chain, supply chain, some of the parts, some of the products could be even manufactured in African continent. That would be a way of connecting the two sides, but also strengthen the ability, the capacity to produce and to supply to the rest of the world.
We have done similar kinds of projects with Western companies that wanted to enter the Arab world, for example. We provided the know-how, the expertise. When you're 7,000 years old, you have a little bit of experience on different things. And we have a good workforce. So using computer technology in Arabic rather than in English was something important to American and Western market. The same, frankly, can apply with Chinese projects. You have a very strong technology innovation base. Again, I'm rather greedy, for the lack of a better word. I don't want to follow. I want to be among the leaders or very close to that pack. Mm-hmm. And so I want to be experienced to new technology that you're addressing. I don't want to listen to it after it becomes only commercial. But again, we can provide China also access to areas in Africa because of our own relations with African countries that it has not traditionally been close to, not only on good commercial terms, but also because we are an African country and have been dealing with other African countries. So these are just some examples, but I really want us to build on the success of BRI and focus on modern technology moving forward so we grow exponentially rather than incrementally. We don't have enough time to grow slowly. Mm-hmm. It's not enough for our generation gap. But I would add also, it's important for us together as political leaders to talk about what kind of order we want in the global sense.
In the global south, you're talking about, where do you see?
No, in the global, it's important for the global South, North Africa, and the global South to talk to China about what the new world order should look like.
Yes. So do you still find that there's a common language, say, between African countries and China? What kind of order, what kind of world we want to see?
I'll tell you, I'm not a Chinese speaker, so I won't claim that there's a common language, but there is a common belief in equality. There is a common belief in that we have equal rights to benefit. Yeah. There's a common belief that we have to respect each other as members of the community, but not necessarily of exactly the same thoughts, the same culture. So in that respect, in that sense, I do believe there's a tremendous comfort zone for Africa and China if we have a larger platform of understanding. That would also facilitate things. I think, and I say this, and I can tell you in my own country, the desire for people to learn Chinese has increased manyfold from what it was when I was a young man years ago. But I would argue also, if you really want to engage Africa, it's not enough to understand Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa. You need to really engage all the people in Africa as well. And you've done a very good effort in that respect, but let's take it a step higher.
Yeah, to a step higher. Of course, in strengthening understanding, one way to do that, of course, is not only people-to-people exchange directly, but also, say, doing investment, doing trade. That's one very important aspect of this relationship. So China-Africa trade that is growing quickly, and China has been committed to enhance this diversity of, say, African export to the Chinese side, to the rest of the world, by promoting non-resource product imports from Africa and providing favorable tariff treatment. So what can we expect? Are we seeing more exports from African nations to the Chinese side, Chinese market, in terms of non-resource products?
I very much thank you for that question. Let me again share it through an experience. My answer to an experience. I visit China frequently, and recently I realized that the direct flights between my country and yours have increased greatly. There's one to Sichuan, there's one to Beijing, there's another towards Guangzhou, and I was surprised. And I got on the flight to Guangzhou to visit, and I asked passengers, Egyptians, what are you going to China for? Are you going to buy a product? And their answer was no, we're actually invested in China to produce there because economically it's beneficial to produce there, and then we will export to other places. So yes, I think it's great that you help African countries export by providing them with advantageous tariffs. But I would encourage you more and more to also encourage them to come and work in your country, invest in your country, and vice versa. I really am extremely comfortable when I see somebody going a little bit ahead of the curve and trying to meet the people on the other side.
Well, in that respect, Mr. Fahmy, of course, there's related criticism, from the West, for example, in terms of Chinese investment in Africa, in particular, I would say financing commitment, to those big projects. They say, there's a trap issue, that trap rather. There's a new practice of new colonialism. I mean, you are from Africa, so what's your response to that kind of, let's say, remarks or criticism?
Let me give you a very direct answer. The debt trap exists, but it's not Chinese. If you take too much debt, you ultimately will have to find a way to manage how you pay back that debt. And the first people who encouraged it was the West. It wasn't the Chinese. And frankly, many of the institutions in the global environment encourage debt. So, and I can tell you, Egypt itself is heavily indebted in many respects. So yeah, I listen to the West when they say debt trap, and I understand what they're saying, but I don't see it as a Chinese emblem. I think they use this politically much more than realistically. If I'm able to get financing that is better from the East than from the West, it would be illogical to say, no, I don't want to take it because I'm worried about the Chinese, but I'm not worried about the West. Doesn't make any sense. And I think they've lost that argument. Where they take advantage is when they see a project being pursued, and then suddenly, because the local environment doesn't understand the Chinese, and the Chinese doesn't understand the local environment, the project doesn't continue. And people feel, well, there's a lot of money being spent here, but has not been successful. So that's what I'm arguing. Our economists should seriously consider debt issues, but debt issues don't have a nationality. They are from anywhere in the world, from anybody, and anywhere as a location. But the logic will always be, they're looking for the best, the West, looking for the best product they can get in the best environment to make it the cheapest they can, and then export it. That's fine. We will do the same. When I visit to China, as I mentioned, my many trips, frankly, when I first visited China, you couldn't see Western products in China. Today, the number of Western products is enormous. Now, these are Western countries exporting their products to China, or actually investing in China to produce their products there, because the market is big. So they want the advantages of China, but they don't want others to have advantage. It doesn't make any sense, frankly. But I agree, over debt is a problem, but it's not Chinese labor.
Thank you, Mr. Fahmy. Thank you for speaking to us.
My pleasure. And I'm sure that this will be an interesting and successful conference. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. With that, we are coming to the end for today's show. Many thanks to Mr. Fahmy. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Jin Duo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.